Okay, this is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 6, the Civil Rights Movement, with the section, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Kennedy's assassination changes everything. Lyndon Johnson assumes the presidency, and he has two huge advantages that Kennedy did not have in terms of being able to pass a civil rights law. Number one is the country is mourning Kennedy deeply, and they believe that Kennedy was working really hard to pass a civil rights law, and then to honor their slain president, Americans in general and Congress in particular said, let's get this done in honor of President Kennedy. That's the first reason. The second reason is that President Johnson was now president, and nobody could work Congress like Lyndon Johnson could work Congress. That Johnson technique, that Johnson treatment that we talked about earlier in the block was deployed to its fullest extent by President Johnson as he worked over individual senators and individual congressmen to pass a law. The momentum started to pick up, and after a lengthy conservative Democratic filibuster, including the longest single speech by any senator in American history, Strom Thurmond of South Carolina spoke for 25 hours straight. After the longest filibuster in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. About 3/4 of Republicans voted in favor, about half of Democrats voted in favor of this landmark Civil Rights Act. And the picture that you see up here is President Johnson signing the act. Right behind him is Martin Luther King. It's the culminating success of Martin Luther King's career, and one of the most important pieces of legislation ever signed by any American president. It did lots of things. It outlawed racial discrimination in most private facilities open to the public. That meant that even if you privately owned a restaurant, privately owned a movie theater, privately owned a business, you could not discriminate based on race. That the days of black lunch counters and white lunch counters, of black movie theaters and white movie theaters, were gone, and gone forever from the United States of America. It strengthened the government's ability to end public segregation, government segregation in things like schools and other public places. That segregation in schools had been illegal since 1954, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the government much more power and authority to actually go after violators of that law. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbade employers from discriminating based on race. That you could not be hired, fired, promoted, or anything based on your race. You had to be hired, fired, and promoted based purely on your ability. It empowered Kennedy's EEOC to enforce these laws. That Kennedy's EEOC funding for it was greatly increased. And it also, as it was almost an aside in the bill, but it became very important also, that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 also forbade discrimination based on gender in all of these fields. That you could not hire, fire, or promote people based on their gender. You could not discriminate based on gender in the workplace. You cannot discriminate based on gender in a private business any longer. This is one of the most important pieces of legislation ever to come off of a president's desk. It represented the apex of Martin Luther King Jr.'s career, and a vindication of all that he and so many millions of other Americans had argued for, and so many thousands of Americans had risked their lives to march in favor of. President Johnson also ordered the federal government to take what he called affirmative action against discrimination. And this program, now, if you read the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it is purely a colorblind document, that racial discrimination in every form is illegal. But right off the bat, President Johnson required the federal government, when seeking contracts, to go and recruit minority and female-owned businesses with which to do business, to go and seek them out. that President Johnson said that, look, legal equality is now the case. We need to now work for social and economic equality. So he ordered the federal government in dealing with contracts to engage in what he called affirmative action, to go out and find black-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, female-owned businesses with which to do business. There's no force behind it before the Griggs case during Richard Nixon's tenure, but the idea that in order to redress past wrongs, government should engage in affirmative action starts right after the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Bill.